Clarity on Fire, a podcast for people who know what they don't want out of their life and career, but aren't sure what they'd rather be doing.
In a world where it's easy to exist, but hard to feel alive, we, Kristen
and Rachel,
2 certified life and career coaches, are here to help you cut through the information overload, get unstuck, and focus not just on how you can have a career you're passionate about, but how to create a whole life that feels fulfilling.
So join us here, where we serve up inspiration and down-to-earth wisdom in a way that only 2 best friends can.
We want you to experience the relief of knowing that, yes, you're allowed to want more out of your life and career.
And no, you don't have to wander through the dark anymore. Our job is to light the fire that shows you the way. Let's go.
Wow. Welcome.
Welcome to what will be a marathon. I was going to say session, but really...
We're going to record this in 2 parts because it's going to be long. I know. I have 4 typed pages of notes.
And that was cutting a lot out.
I cut a lot out.
This is a very, very dense book we're getting into today.
I really want you to do a couple things. 1, hang in there. The content in this is so important, and it's also heavy.
This is an intense topic we're getting into, and it's pervasive.
But it's so necessary for you to hear it, because even if it doesn't apply to you, which is almost impossible that nothing will apply to you just because of how pervasive trauma is on the scale of trauma. Like, there's extreme trauma, but there's also subtle trauma. Or you know someone who is deeply affected by this, and you're going to be able to understand them in a new way. And this taught me a lot, and I've been in this world for such a long time, and it taught me a lot about myself too. So trauma is underlying so much that we don't even understand, that's like just pervading our day to day. And this book is basically like the textbook on trauma. I mean, it really is like a textbook.
It's like a textbook. Rachel and I both took psychology classes in college. I was a psychology minor. I mean, this is a very much like some of the textbooks that I read.
Yeah.
Which I found fascinating then, and it's still fascinating. And sometimes it's really hard to read. But it's really important. So I want to read you the back of the book just to get a little bit of a sense of the overarching idea, what we're getting into here. Trauma is a fact of life. Veterans and their families deal with the painful aftermath of combat. 1 in 5 Americans has been molested. 1 in 4 grew up with alcoholics. 1 in 3 couples have engaged in physical violence. I mean, those numbers are staggering, truly.
Yeah.
Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's foremost experts on trauma, has spent over 3 decades working with survivors. In The Body Keeps the Score, he uses recent scientific advances to show how trauma literally reshapes both body and brain, compromising sufferers' capacities for pleasure, engagement, self-control, and trust. He explores innovative treatments from neurofeedback and meditation to sports, drama, and yoga that offer new paths to recovery by activating the brain's natural neuroplasticity. Based on Dr. van der Kolk's own research and that of other leading specialists, The Body Keeps the Score exposes the tremendous power of our relationships, both to hurt and to heal, and offers new hope for reclaiming lives. This is why we say almost everyone has some version of trauma. Just those numbers alone are staggering. But also the nature of trauma, which we're going to get into, can be really, really huge, or it can be much smaller, and you're still going to be affected in some of those same ways.
So before we dive into this book, which we've broken down into a couple of sections, we're going to do an intro. We're going to talk about where trauma comes from. We're going to talk about how it manifests. Then I think we're going to do a break, and we're going to give you the second part. These episodes, well, you'll know this by the time you're listening to this, but we're going to do them just like on the same day, but we're going to break them down so you don't have to listen to a 2-hour-long episode. And then we'll get into like limitations of treatment and healing from trauma. But before we get into that, trigger warning. Like, I say that very seriously. This book, if you want to listen to this episode, and especially if you want to listen to this book, you got to be okay with hearing about some gnarly stuff.
Some seriously gnarly stuff.
I'm not going to go into graphic detail. And honestly, the book doesn't really go into graphic detail either, but the pure statement of fact of what some people have been through is horrifying enough.
Truly. And if you are someone who has any kind of trauma that might be at all related to some of these stories, there's a chance that's going to bring back some stuff.
Yeah.
So just be aware of that going in. Again, we're not going to get too graphic in this.
But we're going to talk about sexual assault. We're going to talk about violence. We're going to talk about, some unpleasant things. And if you're not feeling that, then this is probably, stop now. That's what I'm telling you.
We're just giving you some advance.
So I wish you would listen to it because I feel like you probably need to hear it. But that's up to you. You know what I mean? You gotta decide what your limits are.
Discern for yourself.
I'm not going to be graphic, but I am going to we are going to state plain facts about here's what happened to this person.
Right.
Okay. What does the body keep the score mean? I want to read you a little snippet from the book, which we're going to do a lot of reading from the book. While we all want to move beyond trauma, the part of our brain that's devoted to ensuring our survival, deep below our rational brain, is not very good at denial. Long after a traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize disturbed brain circuits and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. This precipitates unpleasant emotions, intense physical sensations, and impulsive and aggressive actions. These post-traumatic reactions feel incomprehensible and overwhelming. Feeling out of control, survivors of trauma often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption.
Mm-hmm. Trauma has so many effects on the mind and the body and the spirit and all of that. So that's really what we're talking about here is your body is keeping score of all of that. Even if sometimes your memory is not.
Your rational brain doesn't necessarily... Often trauma can happen even before you're old enough to have real memories, but it affects the way your body's developing too.
Yes.
So, and sometimes even if you are old enough to remember, your memory is good at forgetting things that might be too unpleasant for you to recall.
Or if the trauma was so intense, you might not have even developed memories. That doesn't matter. Your body is still reacting and you're going to have effects.
Yes. That is what the body keeps the score mean. We're going to get much, much more into all of the manifestations of that.
But first we want to just define what is trauma. So here's an interesting way to visualize it directly from the book. The physical trauma, or more precisely, the memory of the trauma, acts like a foreign body which long after its entry must continue to be regarded as an agent that is still at work. Like a splinter that causes an infection, it's the body's response to the foreign object that becomes the problem more than the object itself.
I find that to be so fascinating, that you can have something happen to you, and it's not so much what happened to you, but how you continue to respond to it that ends up being the most traumatic. This is a thing he revisits over and over and over again. And you're going to hear it multiple times, but it's good because I think you need to hear it multiple times for it to really sink in. That the way that we eventually move on from trauma is by reintegrating it with our past. When something is traumatic, it's because it literally freezes us in time. And our body and our mind keeps acting as if we are still there. And so we can't move on. We can't think straight. We can't function normally.
Yeah, almost everything or almost anything can re-traumatize that and make it feel like what happened
is still happening.
A decade ago, 2 decades ago is happening currently in your current experience.
Yes.
That's why it's so debilitating for so many people. So, right, it's not about trying to ignore or forget about it. It's about integrating it in such a new way that you can respond as if it is a thing in your past and move on.
It's just, it might be a really bad thing that happened to you, but it feels like a long time ago, as opposed to your body and your mind are still acting like it's happening now.
Yep.
And a lot of us don't realize based on, because sometimes it really is just the body that's acting out. It's not it doesn't feel like you're still thinking about it or fixating on what happened, but your body keeps the score. Your body's still acting like it's happening.
Right. The anxiety or the anger or
I learned
the depression.
so much about myself in that way because of how...
keeps getting re-triggered and reactivated.
How personally I'm still an anxious person. And I'm like, well, mentally, I don't have anything to be anxious about, but physically, my body is still acting like I do. And so I've clearly got some stuff, and I in reading this, discovered some things I really want to try for myself. Okay, so we're going to talk about section kind of 1. This is so boring. I hope this isn't boring. Section 1. But I want to break this down into pieces. So the first major thing we want to focus on where does trauma come from? And he spends a lot of time in this book because he is an expert. I mean, this guy has seen everything. He's done everything. He was one of the first people to treat PTSD in veterans, to call it for what it was, too. He's in his 70s now, so he's had a very long history of treating this.
And
so
whenever a new treatment comes up, he's one of the first to try to implement it on himself with his patients. He is fully
super
committed.
open-minded. He spends a lot of time in this book because of all of his experiences focusing on pretty heavy stuff like PTSD and the effects of severe and like obvious causes of trauma, violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, war, natural disasters, like accidents, like bad car accidents and that type of thing. But I don't want you to feel like just because those are the examples and that's what he spends time focusing on, that it's not applicable to people who haven't experienced the worst of the worst. There's a great part we're going to get into later about how to tell how traumatized you are. And I got to be honest, even people who have like a 0 out of 10 on the trauma spectrum can still benefit from the things that we talk about later on in terms of healing, because no one's mind is perfect and no one's body is responding perfectly. So we can always improve. This is going to resonate probably the most with people who have a little bit to a lot of trauma, though, obviously.
Yes. Yeah. And your body is going to respond. So it depends a lot on context and paradigm. So if you've not had any trauma and then you have something that's really challenging, your body still might respond from a PTSD kind of perspective. So just know that this applies big and small scale.
Okay. So again, focusing on where does it come from? Here's what he says. When the brain's alarm system is turned on, it automatically triggers pre-programmed physical escape plans in the oldest part of the brain. As in other animals, the nerves and chemicals that make up our basic brain structure have a direct connection with our body. When the old brain takes over, it partially shuts down the higher brain, our conscious mind, and propels the body to run, hide, fight, or on occasion freeze. By the time we're fully aware of our situation, our body may already be on the move. If the fight, flight, freeze response is successful and we escape the danger, we recover our internal equilibrium and gradually regain our senses. But if for some reason the normal response is blocked, for example, when people are held down, trapped, or otherwise prevented from taking effective action, be it in a war zone, a car accident, domestic violence, or rape, the brain keeps secreting stress chemicals and the brain's electrical circuits continue to fire in vain. Long after the actual event has passed, the brain may keep sending signals to the body to escape a threat that no longer exists. Since at least 1889, when the French psychologist Pierre Janet published the first scientific account of traumatic stress, it's been recognized that trauma survivors are prone to continue the action, or rather, the futile attempt at action which began when the thing happened. Being able to move and do something to protect oneself is a critical factor in determining whether or not a horrible experience will leave long-lasting scars. I had never, ever thought about that. That was news to me. But it makes perfect sense that your body is trying to finish what it started. Like, I want to run away from this. Right. And I never got the chance.
So if you are someone who's had a really, really traumatic or intense experience and maybe you shut down, you're going to keep shutting down. If you got really agitated and anxious, that might keep happening. So even though you're not in that situation anymore, your body doesn't know that. It's acting as if you are in that situation over and over and over again. So that's where the healing needs to happen. We're going to get into that part.
And that's kind of like interesting scale on how traumatic something becomes is, were you able to flee? Were you able to fight back? Were you able to run away? Were you able to defend yourself? And if you weren't, if you were stuck in a situation, that will determine how traumatized you got by it.
Yes. So this probably makes sense then in this context of if you're feeling trapped. If you have, we'll say the easiest, I mean, very relatively speaking.
That's relative.
The easiest type of trauma to heal is if you were an adult when you experience a traumatic event versus a child. Again, contextually, that's not always true. But think about it. If you're a child, you are with you're with a parents or adults or whoever it is that's abusing you.
Completely
you don't have any
of what's
control.
Around you. No control.
You are completely dependent as a child. So it makes sense why that's one of the reasons why that might create some longer lasting scars. Just be a little harder to unravel.
It impacts, if you're an adult who had a healthy childhood where you didn't have any trauma and then you were traumatized as an adult, it's easier to heal that because your brain was not impacted by trauma.
Yeah, your actual development as a child, your brain development, your hormonal development, all of that gets impacted. And that's your normal moving forward in your life.
the brain develops in a use-dependent way. So if you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration and play and cooperation. But if you're frightened and you're unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. So, the brain, again, huge plasticity in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a kid and you're living in an emotionally volatile or physically volatile situation, then your brain is going to become attuned to that. And it's going to deeply interfere with normal functioning. And as an adult, you might be like, but nothing super severely traumatic happened to me. But if we're going to talk about this more, but like if you lived in any sort of situation where it was volatile, your brain developed to deal with that, not with normal stuff.
Right. Another big factor, especially for kids, is attachment issues and how that can create trauma as well. We just reposted our episode on attachment styles earlier this week.
Yeah, if you want to get even deeper into attachment styles, go back to Tuesday and re-listen to that episode. But attachment is super critical.
Oh, yeah. So, and it starts in childhood. It starts with your parents or whoever was your caretaker. So how attuned you are or how in sync you are with your parents, and I mean, particularly your mother, for most people, was critical to a healthy development of your brain and of future attachment styles with other people. So if your parents were traumatized themselves, or they're struggling to kind of emotionally regulate or connect with you, that's absolutely going to affect you as the kid.
Yeah.
In order to develop healthy relationships with other people and understand where you fit in the mix, it's going to just seriously create a lot of anxiety.
I know you're going to read something from the book, but I want to just say for people who don't know what attachment styles are, there's a number of them, but there's secure attachment and there's unhealthy, insecure attachment. And you don't have to necessarily have been traumatized to have insecure attachment. Your parents don't necessarily have to have been traumatized to not be able to parent you in a way that creates secure attachment. But in a healthy parent-child relationship, especially the mother is very attuned to the needs of the child, and the child can reliably count on their mother to meet their needs. And insecure attachment is created when you cannot count on your mother to actually be emotionally and physically attuned to you.
And there's a couple of types of, and that's what we got into earlier in the week. So go definitely listen to that episode on attachment
So even
styles.
if you've never been traumatized, if you were parented in a way that did not lead to secure attachment, you absolutely, that's a form of trauma, basically.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so here's a direct quote from the book. As children, we start off at the center of our own universe, where we interpret everything that happens from an egocentric vantage point. If our parents or grandparents keep telling us we're the cutest, most delicious thing in the world, we don't question their judgment. We must be exactly that. And deep down, no matter what else we learn about ourselves, we will carry that sense with us, that we are basically adorable. As a result, if we later hook up with somebody who treats us badly, we'll be outraged. It won't feel right. It's not familiar. It's not like home. But if we are abused or ignored in childhood, or grow up in a family where sexuality is treated with disgust, our inner map contains a different message. Our sense of self is marked by contempt and humiliation, and we're more likely to think, he or she has my number, and fail to protest if we are mistreated. Yeah. This is so huge. It's where is your set point set way, way, way back in childhood of what is acceptable treatment and how worthy you are. Yeah. And then you will seek out relationships with people that match your level of worthiness.
And likely traumatize you more.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And just repeat the patterns and make you feel even less worthy. Yeah. To see it's happening again and again and again.
So if you have a lot of anxiety and you're like, I don't know why I'm anxious because I wasn't ever mistreated, no one abused me, but you have a very, very insecure or anxious parent, likely they weren't able to establish a secure, healthy attachment to you. And so in lacking that, you also became anxious. It's not just that you're modeling their behavior, it's that it actually affected the way that your brain developed and your nervous system developed. And so that's why it's so easy to think that this is genetic. We think that, people look at mental illness and they think, oh, well, I have a history of depression in my family. And it's not necessarily as genetically inherited as you'd think. He says, after 30 years and millions upon millions of dollars worth of research, we have failed to find consistent genetic patterns for schizophrenia or any psychiatric illness for that matter. However, epigenetics, which is like where life events trigger and change the expression of your genes, that does have a clear role in trauma. He gives a really interesting example from the book.
Children whose pregnant mothers had been trapped in unheated houses in a prolonged ice storm in Quebec had major epigenetic changes compared with the children of mothers who had heat and that had been restored within a day. I mean, think about that. Think about the fact that as adults, right, with this pregnant mother, right, is having this traumatic experience of being, practically worrying about freezing to death, I'm sure. The children end up having different genetic changes because of that experience that happened. This is not like they were built this way coming in.
No.
This happened as they were developing in the womb.
Yes.
That tells you situational experiences have such an effect on our chemistry, our biology, and our development.
Mm-hmm.
That's
so it's not so much that you're just inheriting bipolar from your mom. It's that, we'll talk about this later. He talks about there's always a root cause of mental illness, like bipolar, schizophrenia. It's almost always rooted in trauma in some way. So, you can think, well, my mom is bipolar. I inherited it from her. But did you inherit it from her because her genes, or her genetics are that? Or because like her experience and her inability to potentially show up for you emotionally triggered a gene that you guys both had, right? Like it's kind of...
It's not so cut and dry.
It's not so cut and dry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we promised you that we were going to give a little bit of an indicator of how to tell
just how traumatized you are.
And there actually is a way of measuring this.
Yes, it's called the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences score. And I will actually link in the show notes to an article I found on NPR that has a really easy little quiz built into it where you can take the ACE quiz. Mm-hmm. It's only 10 questions. I'm sure you could find it by Googling other things. This is just where I found it, and I felt like NPR was a reliable source for it. I didn't want to be taking a fake version of it or something.
Yeah.
But you could also Google childhood ACE test and probably come up with it. ACE test. Mm-hmm. So it's just, again, 10 questions. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to read you a few of them so you get the idea. And if you say yes to any of them, your score is out of 10.
Yeah,
so you might
each
have...
yes is 1 point.
Yes.
And there's up to 10 points you can get.
Yeah. So did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, or put you down? Did one of your parents often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Did an adult or person at least 5 years older ever have you touch their body in a sexual way? Or did an adult or person at least 5 years older ever attempt oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? I won't go on, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's 10 of those questions. So I took it.
Mm-hmm.
I got 2 out of 10.
I got 0.
Yeah, Kristen is one of the
maybe
rare
half,
untraumatized
really
people.
No.
Which doesn't mean you didn't have issues, but I do see the difference in you and me. Me having 2 and you having 0, I wonder if that explains my tendency toward anxiety and depression and your absolute lack of either of those things, really.
Yeah, that's
you get overwhelmed, but you don't have anxiety.
No.
And my set point seems to be anxious. I've had to work really hard for it not to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we're going to give some stats about what does it mean to be, somewhere on this scale.
Yeah, because it's dramatic where you are on this scale. It can have a huge impact on your life.
Okay, so just to start off with a bang, there is a 5,000% increase in suicide rate between a 0% or 0 score and a 6 ACE score. We're not even talking about 10.
We're talking
about 6.
Yeah.
5,000%. That is
right. So
staggering.
People don't just commit suicide randomly. It's in direct correlation to how traumatized you are. This should make sense, but I don't actually know that everyone thinks of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
People with a score of 4 or more were 7 times more likely to... Actually, I think it's just people with a score of 4, let alone the people who are higher than 4.
Yeah.
But people with just a score of 4 were 7 times more likely to be alcoholic than adults with 0 ACEs.
Again, so you can imagine the higher you get up on that scale, this just goes astronomically out of proportion.
Yeah.
Okay, so 5% of adult women with a score of 0 experience rape. 5%. Compared to 33% of adult women with a score of 4 or higher.
So this is not women who have ever been sexually assaulted or raped. We're talking as adults, like after the age of 18, have experienced rape. 33% of people
with a score of 4 or higher.
4 or higher. So what that tells you is that your set point determines a lot about what behavior you will find acceptable and allow into your experience, which is not to say it's victim blaming at all.
No,
but
it's just saying your fear barometer is off.
Complete. You can't assess people correctly. So you might not even be able to properly assess danger.
So subconsciously, you're finding yourself in situations where you're more at the effect of people's violence.
Yeah.
Because that's normal to you. And your sensors don't go off as early as someone who never had any kind of trauma before.
Right.
Their sensors are very highly attuned.
Right. You can get almost numb to things that are absolutely abhorrent.
Yes.
People with a score of 6 or higher are twice as likely to suffer from cancer and 4 times as likely to have emphysema. Guys, the body keeps the score.
Yes.
Like, that is the point.
Your
Cancer.
biology
People think cancer is like just random. And this is saying, no, you are literally twice as likely to have cancer if you are traumatized. Like if you are, pretty moderately to severely traumatized, twice as likely to have cancer.
And think about what's going on in your body. We don't even fully understand, Rich and I don't fully understand all of the chemical and biological impacts.
Right. Just
even knowing
hormones.
how much cortisol is in your body, just knowing how tense your body is and how different functions in fight or flight shut down, digestion and things like that shut down when you're stressed and anxious. Your body is reacting to all of this. So, okay, that was a lot already.
Yes. Okay.
We're going to move into phase 2 of this whole topic here. And this is getting into the various ways that trauma manifests.
Yeah. So we talked about how to tell if you're traumatized and where it comes from. But now we're going to talk about how it actually shows up, because there's a number of ways that it shows up. So Kristen's going to read something from the book about him giving Rorschach tests to veterans. If you guys don't know what a Rorschach test is, it's those ink blot tests where it just looks like a random shape and then you have people interpret what it means. And if you're not traumatized, you tend to just give like, it's a butterfly. And the more traumatized you are, the more you tend to see violence in it.
Yeah, it's a reflection of your inner world.
Yeah.
Okay. We learned from these Rorschach tests that traumatized people have a tendency to superimpose their trauma on everything around them and have trouble deciphering whatever it is going on around them. There appeared to be little in between. We also learned that trauma affects the imagination. The 5 men who saw nothing in the blots had lost the capacity to let their minds play. And that's an option too. It's not just seeing horrific things or neutral things. Sometimes people just, they can't even engage their imagination to see
They literally see
anything.
nothing. Yeah.
But so too had the 16 other men, for in viewing scenes from the past in those blots, they were not displaying the mental flexibility that is the hallmark of imagination. They simply kept replaying an old reel. Imagination is absolutely critical to the quality of our lives. Our imagination enables us to leave our routine everyday existence by fantasizing about travel, food, sex, falling in love, or having the last word. All the things that make life interesting. Imagination gives us the opportunity to envision new possibilities. It's an essential launch pad for making our hopes and dreams come true. It fires our creativity, relieves our boredom, alleviates our pain, enhances our pleasure, and enriches our most intimate relationships. When people are compulsively and constantly pulled back into the past, to the last time they felt intense involvement and deep emotions, they suffer from a failure of imagination, a loss of the mental flexibility. Without imagination, there is no hope, no chance to envision a better future, no place to go, and no goal to reach. I had never thought about imagination like that as a way of
Seeing possibilities.
seeing hope.
Yeah.
And believing that something better is possible for you. And even just being able to imagine different scenarios in your life as just an intrigue factor, like to feel engaged in your life. It's so much more important than I think we give it credit. And trauma just often will kill that part of you.
It's kind of insidious in this deeper way, too, where he says whether the trauma had occurred 10 years in the past or more than 40, my patients could not bridge the gap between their wartime experiences and their current lives. Somehow, the very event that caused them so much pain had also become their sole source of meaning. They felt fully alive only when they were revisiting their traumatic past.
Mm-hmm.
That's so sad, but it's so true, because if that was the last time that it was like everything that happened before that was like when I felt alive. And then this event happened, and that was the last time I remember feeling anything. And now I keep going back there. Yeah.
Yes. And so now if I want to feel alive again, I have to go back to that awful place.
So again, how it's manifesting is it's sapping your ability to imagine a different possibility, because it's keeping you stuck in something that happened a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. It's also absolutely changing the whole landscape of your brain. So
yes,
I'm going to give
on like a chemical and a wiring level, it's changing your whole brain.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a little bit more on that point. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We've discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually it's not enough. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the processes by which it heals. To me, that just says we need a multifaceted approach here. You need to be able to use language and imagination, but you also have to actually get your body physically back aligned so that you're not physically and hormonally reliving the same thing over and over again.
So speaking of hormonally, it changes the landscape of your brain. It changes your stress response, like your hormonal system. He says, ideally, our stress hormone system should provide a lightning fast response to threat, but then quickly return us to equilibrium. In PTSD patients, however, the stress hormone system fails at this balancing act. Fight, flight, freeze signals continue after the danger is over. And as in the case of dogs, these are dogs who almost drowned because they were in a basement and they were in cages and they were like test dogs, like psychological experiment dogs. And the water came up and they didn't drown, but now they were all so traumatized because they thought they were going to, and they couldn't run away because they were stuck in cages. Yes. They don't return to normal after that. Instead, the continued secretion of stress hormones is expressed as agitation and panic, and in the long term wreaks havoc with their health. So like,
it breaks my heart.
It's changing your brain. It's changing the way that your stress, your fight flight response, like just activates. And we're going to talk about that more in a little bit, about how it creates a faulty alarm system. But we got a couple other things we want to talk about first, because it also disrupts your ability to be present. Like, Again,
you're reliving the past or worrying about the future, but you're not really here.
And your body is stuck, or you're not actually mentally reliving it, but your body is stuck having a stress response to something that's no longer present.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another quote about that. When something reminds traumatized people of the past, their right brain reacts as if the traumatic event were happening in the present. But because their left brain is not working very well, they may not be aware that they are re-experiencing and reenacting the past. They're just furious, terrified, enraged, ashamed, or frozen. After the emotional storm passes, they may look for something or somebody to blame for it. They behaved the way they did because you were 10 minutes late, or because you burned the potatoes, or because you never listened to me. Of course, most of us have done this from time to time, but when we cool down, we hopefully can admit our mistake. Trauma interferes with this kind of awareness, and over time, our research demonstrated why.
So I just want you to be really clear. If you're thinking about yourself or you're thinking about someone you know and you're thinking, wow, that person is really reactive and they fly off the handle at anything and they seem to be very trigger happy, or maybe I am so easy to get anxious, or I'm so easy to get frustrated and I don't understand why, there's a reason behind it.
In coaching, there's a phrase that we learned years ago that says, if a reaction is hysterical, it's historical, which just means if the reaction is way, way, way bigger than the trigger, there's pretty much always a historical reason.
And the person
why.
doesn't have to know why, because again, it's messing with how your brain is wired, with how your chemical reaction happens. So it's not a conscious thought a lot of the time. It's just
a physiological reaction.
It's a response that you can't control. So, okay, more on that. What am I reading? Third paragraph? I'm telling you, this book is so dense. Okay. Pierre Janet coined the term disassociation to describe the splitting off and isolation of memory imprints that he saw in his patients. He was also prescient about the heavy cost of keeping these traumatic experiences at bay. He later wrote that when patients disassociate their traumatic experience, they become attached to an insurmountable obstacle. Unable to integrate their traumatic memories, they seem to lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences as well. It's as if their personality has definitely stopped at a certain point and cannot enlarge anymore by the addition or assimilation of new elements. He predicted that unless they become aware of the split-off elements and integrated them into a story that had happened in the past but was now over, they would experience a slow decline in their personal and professional functioning. This phenomenon has now been well documented in contemporary research. Like, you cannot, it impacts your ability clearly to learn and to integrate new information because, again, you are frozen in time, physiologically, mentally, around something that happened long, long, long ago.
I mean, and this makes sense too if we're thinking about the physiological effects of reliving that over and over again. Trauma also changes your actual nervous system because that's your body's reaction to stressful situations. So here's another quote. After trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their life. These attempts to maintain control over unbearable physiological reactions can result in a whole range of physical symptoms, including fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and other autoimmune diseases. This explains why it is critical for trauma treatment to engage the entire organism, body, mind, and brain. Again, this is usually a multifaceted approach to calm down so many different parts of you that are affected by this trauma.
So he describes like how it affects your nervous system as it creates a faulty alarm system. So like the fight-flight response is normal, but in traumatized people, there's an overactive amygdala, which is the body's alarm system. And it processes, because the amygdala processes information faster than the frontal lobes, because the amygdala is part of that old lizard brain. And it processes information a little bit faster than the frontal lobes of your brain, which is your executive functioning. It decides whether incoming information is a threat to our survival even before we're consciously aware of the danger. So what's happening then with traumatized people is that they don't even have the choice to logically assess or rationally assess whether something is a threat or whether something should set off their alarm system. Their alarm system is going to be set off faster than they can rationally think.
Which often means even when you do understand why that's happening, it's almost too late to rely on your rational brain because your body is already reacting. You're already having stress pumping through your system. You're already feeling tense or scared or angry. And then trying to rationalize it then is a lot harder.
So you mentioned fibromyalgia a second ago, and he talks a lot
chronic
about
fatigue, some of those different things.
Yeah, how trauma manifests as seemingly quote unquote unrelated ailments. He says, many of my patients respond to stress not by noticing and naming it, but by developing migraine headaches or asthma attacks. Sandy, a middle-aged visiting nurse, told me she'd felt terrified and lonely as a child, unseen by her alcoholic parents. She dealt with this by becoming deferential to everybody she depended on, including me, her therapist. Whenever her husband made an insensitive remark, she would come down with an asthma attack. By the time she noticed that she couldn't breathe, it was too late for an inhaler to be effective, and she had to be taken to the emergency room. Suppressing our inner cries for help does not stop our stress hormones from mobilizing the body. Even though Sandy had learned to ignore her relationship problems and block out her physical distress signals, they showed up in symptoms that demanded her attention. Her therapy focused on identifying the link between her physical sensations and her emotions, and I also encouraged her to enroll in a kickboxing program. She had no emergency room visits during the 3 years she was my patient.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, your body is keeping the score. It is having a very
this woman,
intense reaction.
She didn't want to see, she didn't want to think about it, but her body was manifesting it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the thing, is that you cannot ignore this stuff because it's going to find a way to get out.
Yeah. Well, here are some of the ways.
Yeah, okay. More ways that it gets out.
Somatic symptoms for which no clear physical basis can be found are ubiquitous in traumatized children and adults. They can include chronic back and neck pain, fibromyalgia, migraines, digestive problems, spastic colon or irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue, and some forms of asthma. Traumatized children have 50 times the rate of asthma as their non-traumatized peers. This is not a coincidence.
Right. So, right.
50 times.
Yes.
Studies have shown that many children and adults with fatal asthma attacks were not aware of having breathing problems before the attacks.
Yeah.
You can see there is a very clear collaboration or connection.
Correlation.
That's the word I'm looking for. Correlation.
Asthma and trauma are collaborating.
Between those two. I mean, like, your body it's having a reaction to all of the physical effects.
I don't have asthma, but that list, I was like, yep. Like a lot of the things you read on that, I was like, oh, I had that. I have that. I deal with that. Like, I've done a lot of healing, and I think I've gotten over a lot of trauma, but I'm still super anxious in a lot of ways. And I'm like, oh, more healing to do. So yeah, I can attest to it shows up physically. Okay. It also makes you lose your sense of self. This is trippy. Like, literally your ability to experience yourself as a person.
Yeah. There was some examples that were really almost hard to conceptualize. Yeah. Severely traumatized people often struggle to recognize themselves in a mirror, or sometimes they can't actually even feel certain parts of their body. So just think about how dissociated you have to become from your body to look at yourself in the mirror and not recognize that it's you, or to try to feel a part of your body. And there's like numbness there.
Yeah. There's a word for this that he taught us, well, in the book, called alexithymia, which is Greek for no words for your feelings. So he says, many traumatized children and adults simply cannot describe what they're feeling because they cannot identify what their physical sensations mean. They may look furious but deny that they're angry. They may appear terrified but say that they're fine. Not being able to discern what's going on inside their bodies causes them to be out of touch with their needs, and they have trouble taking care of themselves, whether it involves eating the right amount at the right time or getting the sleep they need. Like my aunt, he had an aunt who really struggled with this after a traumatic history. Alexithymics substitute the language of action for that of emotion. When asked, how would you feel if you saw a truck coming at you at 80 miles per hour? Most people would say, I'd be terrified, or I'd be frozen with fear. An alexithymic might reply, how would I feel? I don't know, I'd get out of the way. They tend to register emotions as physical problems rather than as signals that something deserves their attention. Instead of feeling angry or sad, they experience muscle pain, bowel irregularities, or other symptoms for which no cause can be found. About 3/4 of patients with anorexia nervosa and more than half of all patients with bulimia are bewildered by their emotional feelings and have great difficulty describing them. When researchers showed pictures of angry or distressed faces to people with alexithymia, they could not figure out what those people were feeling.
I mean, how do you heal from something that you can't even describe?
Well, so
right?
This right here is, we're not quite at this point yet, but this right here leads well into what the next section, which we'll start a new episode about that, the limitations of treatment. Because as I was reading that, I was like, this is why some people are not good candidates for coaching. Is because...
Or therapy, for that matter.
Well, we talk about that, is that talk therapy or like talking through your issues is helpful up to a point. But if you're the type of person who is traumatized, and you don't realize it, and you don't realize that the reason you can't figure out what you want or articulate how you feel, I have worked with clients who struggle to name how they feel.
Yes.
Like, they are very disconnected from their emotions. And I can work through it with people, but to a degree, there are definitely some people that I have worked with over the years who I'm like, oh, in hindsight, that person had trauma. And that person was struggling to give voice to how they felt, likely because of this.
Yeah, I mean...
Because they've lost that connection with their sense of self.
I've definitely had milder versions of that example that you just read, which is I'll ask a client, how do you feel about that? And they'll say, well, I think this. And now sometimes I'd be like, no.
How do you feel?
I understand how you think. How do you feel? And they'll really struggle and might go back into, well, I would do this. And you're like, and this is sometimes even just hard for people without a lot of trauma to identify that, but it's especially hard to get into that feeling place when you have experienced
I would say if you're like, wait, am I traumatized? Because I actually struggle to voice how I feel. The answer is maybe, but I would take that ACE quiz.
Yes, that's going to be more clarifying.
And also, if you're like noticing a lot of patterns here and what we're talking about, if you're like, wait, I react really sensitively to things and I struggle with a lot of chronic ailments and I have a history of mental illness, and I have trouble voicing how I feel, then the more
this is resonating.
Things the more things you're able to check, the more that it's likely that, it's not just that you've been cultured, which we have as a society, into thinking as opposed to feeling. That's something all of us have been encouraged to do, is think rather than feel. But if you're resonating with more than just this, you're resonating with a lot of it, then you might have a touch of alexithymia. You might have a real struggle with connecting with yourself. Mm-hmm. But we're going to talk about healing from it.
There's a lot of ways of healing.
It's totally possible to overcome it and to heal from it. We're not going to get into that in this one. We're going to go into that in part 2.
Yes. Okay. But just for one more piece of this, of how kind of trauma manifests, is in some of its more extreme cases, it can actually cause you to question your very reality.
Your sense of reality. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's another piece about that. In order to know who we are, to have an identity, we must know, or at least feel that we know, what is and what was real. We must observe what we see around us and label it correctly. We must also be able to trust our memories and be able to tell them apart from our imagination. Losing the ability to make these distinctions is one sign of what psychoanalyst William Niederland calls soul murder. Erasing awareness and cultivating denial are often essential to survival, but the price is that you lose track of who you are, of what you are feeling, and of what and whom you can trust.
And why denial, on a soul murder note, y'all.
Denial is a coping mechanism. That's why it's called that. It is not a healing mechanism. It helps you lose track of what's real anymore because you get stuck in like,
well, if you're committed to not knowing something or not seeing it or not dealing with it, then that becomes how you approach everything.
And then you don't know what to trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another big factor, is if you feel like, I don't know what to trust, I don't know what's real anymore, very likely signs of some trauma.
Okay. That concludes part 1 of our presentation. So we're cutting it off because this is a lot. So if you want to like go and pause and like process and then come back to part 2, that's what we encourage you to do that. You don't have to jump right in. Otherwise, this also would have been like a 2-hour podcast and I'm not having that.
And just know that the next one is going to be more about treatments, limitations of treatments, possibilities for treatments.
Yeah.
So I hope it's going to be a little bit more of like a positive flair. If you do feel like some of this might be relevant to you or people you know.
Possibilities.
Yes.
And then also helping you avoid the pitfalls of some traditional treatment to trauma that doesn't necessarily work.
At least not for all cases.
And help you question the establishment. Because again, the establishment doesn't always know what it's doing. Mm-hmm. So also, I just want to say, if you've ever been inclined to give us a rating or a review, I would appreciate it now, maybe more than ever, because of how much time and energy we have put into distilling this information and bringing it to you.
Think about like the most intense book report
you've ever done. This book is so long. I had to keep myself to a reading schedule. Last weekend, I had to sit down and read 100 pages just to finally finish it. I had to like put reading hours into place.
And I've
spent 3 hours creating the outline, and now we're spending about 2 recording it. So I'm like,
and it's not just long and dense. It is heavy.
It's emotionally
we've had
heavy
to read some stuff that we did not share on here on purpose because, you got to be prepared.
Which isn't to say you shouldn't read this book, because I actually hope that this will make you want to learn more, because there's so much we couldn't include.
But just know it's not easy reading.
No, it's incredibly profound, and I think it's necessary. And I'm so glad I read it. Like, full stop. Really glad I read it. But this was like bar none, the hardest book club we've ever had to do for multiple reasons.
So yes,
If you ever want to give us a rating and a review.
Rating and review, because we're not getting paid to do this podcast. We do it because we want to share this information.
Yeah. So I hope you want to read it. But if you're like, great, I don't need to read it now, give me a rating and a review to pay me for having read it for you. Okay. So we will be back. Well, we are back. Just if you want to move on to part 2, move on to part 2. If you want to take a break, take a break. And we will see you in part 2 for healing from trauma.
Okay. We'll be right back.